Those of you who are international lawyers will, of course, be well familiar with the name of Mark McConnell, and I found at least one person in the audience who knows exactly who you are. Anyway, he's been working with Hogan Lovells for a long time and retired a couple of years ago, and working on the horrible familiar term which he gave to me, international trade disputes, and I couldn't help thinking about the plight of Britain as we head for Brexit. And nobody can agree how on earth to resolve an international trade dispute. Maybe you can do it before you go. Anyway, background in economics, Johns Hopkins, and then MBA and so forth, work at Stanford, and concentrating on finance and accounting. And it's that background which I think is going to inform a lot of what he's going to say this morning against the evidence of another kind, which is in the Plantin archives. And I think without further ado, and without spoiling any of his secrets, I'm going to hand it over now to Mark to talk about Toward a Cost Model of Early Printing. Mark.
Well, thank you a lot, Professor McKittrick. You have reminded me how grateful I am to be here rather than back in the office sweating about what our president is about to do next in the trade world. So this is a real pleasure. I'm delighted to be here this morning. I'm going to talk about a project that involves really the remarkable cost data that we have from Christopher Plantin's operations in the 1560s. In any business, costs influence decisions. An early printer had to decide whether to print, how many copies, whether to use fine paper, and so on. Each of those decisions involved costs, and understanding those costs accordingly can help us understand how publishing decisions were made. We have detailed cost data for just under 4 years, from 1563 to 1567. The reason for that is that Plantin was in a partnership at the time, and his partners demanded that he keep careful cost records. So for each book, he recorded the number of copies printed, the type and cost of paper, individual labor costs, and so on. These data tell us a lot, and I think they actually may be unique in this time period in the book world. I'm compiling them into a database, and it's frankly a work in progress. But today I'm going to focus on an important threshold issue, which is whether the business was capital intensive or not. I conclude that it was not, and show how that might have affected some of Plantin's thinking about his decisions. Then I'll finish with a brief description about where the project can go in the future. So, what does capital intensity really mean? Let's look at the concept first in modern business. Some businesses need a lot of expensive equipment to operate. Airlines, oil refineries are good examples. Others don't, like travel agencies or restaurants. A restaurant will have some kitchen equipment, but most of its expenditures are the cost of food and the cost of labor. How does this affect decisions? This chart compares a capital-intensive cost structure, like an airline on the left, to that of a restaurant, a variable cost structure, on the right. The bars represent the percentage of cost of one unit of production. One airline flight, one restaurant meal. The airline bar is capital intensive. 30% of its costs are fixed. That's the orange part of the bar. And I base this ratio loosely on the financial statements of United Airlines. These costs are, the fixed costs are airplanes, which basically have to be paid for whether they fly or not. The variable costs, the blue part, are fuel and flight crews. These costs are incurred only if the airplane actually flies. That's why they're variable. Look at the difference between that and the restaurant on the right, where only 10% of the costs are fixed. I base this loosely on the financial statements of a company called Fiesta Restaurant Group, which operates restaurants in Texas and the American Southwest. As you can see, the overwhelming majority of the costs in the restaurant model are variable, 90%. The airline has a much higher percentage of fixed costs. So how does this make incentives differ? Well, if price is 150, the red bar in the chart here, both businesses can sell and make money. But if price drops to 80, they have very different incentives at that point. The restaurant has to pay $90 or 90% in cash to put a meal on the table. And at this price, it's going to lose 10 for every meal that it sells. It can't do that for very long. But the airline will keep flying. It has to spend 70 in cash to fly, but it will get 80 back. It's not an accounting profit. It's actually not really a very good situation, but it's cash income of 10. So the airline will keep going at a price decline where the restaurant would shut down. A second difference is the incentive to produce large volumes. This is the same chart we've been looking at with one added fact. This is the cost situation that each business faces at a specific level of production. Both businesses are producing 100 units in this example, 100 meals, 100 flights. What happens if both businesses expand production to 300 units? This is shown on the right. The cost per unit changes. The blue variable costs stay the same because that doesn't change with an expansion of production. But look at the change in the orange bars. Fixed costs per unit get smaller as volume increases. They're spread over 3 times as many units, so they're 1/3 of what they used to be per unit. This really matters for the airline. By flying more, its total cost has dropped to 80. But the change doesn't matter nearly so much for the restaurant. Since its fixed costs aren't so large, spreading them isn't so important. Now, unfortunately for the airline, this also works in reverse. Here I have the baseline of 100 units on the left again, and now compare it to a situation where production drops to only 50 units. The airline's in big trouble. Its total cost per flight just went up 30%. Capital-intensive businesses need to have large volume, and this airline doesn't have it anymore. But the restaurant's in much better shape. The airline is going to be desperate to increase its volume. The restaurant, not so much. Now, a number of you are probably thinking you've wandered into the wrong conference. What does this have to do with printing in the 16th century? The answer is that we can learn about Plantin's business if we know whether it's capital intensive. So let's look at his costs. First, we see a group of assets that look like capital assets: real estate, printing presses, typographical materials. We also see some costs that are clearly variable, mostly paper and wages. And then there's a third category, other costs. Some of these are variable, like ink. Others may be fixed costs, like composing sticks and small tools, but they're simply too small to be worth tracking. So in the third box, most of these amounts are small, and we can ignore them in our analysis, with 2 caveats. First, the management payments on the right. These are not small, but they were paid to Plantin and to Cornel Bomberg, who were also owners of the business. They don't represent a real economic cost, so much as an arrangement among the owners to distribute a first call on the profits of the business. So I've left them out. Second, I've also left out illustration blocks. They raise a really difficult question of allocation to specific books. So for today, let's just consider these conclusions to be applicable to non-illustrated books. I hope to revisit that as we look at individual publishing decisions. Now, how then do we look at Plantin's costs? We need to do 3 things. We need to quantify the costs, we need to decide whether they're fixed or variable, and we need to attribute the costs to the books published in 1564, because that's the year for which at the moment I have variable costs. Then we can make a meaningful comparison between the two. So let's walk through them. We'll start with real estate. This one's actually pretty easy. It's set forth in the partnership agreement. Plantin was given 150 florins a year to provide the premises. This cost will be incurred no matter what level of production is undertaken, so real estate's a fixed cost at 150 florins annually. Now, printing actually began in October 1563, although all the books worked on that year were published the next year in 1564. So books in 1564 and variable costs in 1564 actually represent 15 months' work. So to ensure a fair comparison, I enter 15 months worth of fixed costs. For real estate, that's about 188 florins. Next is printing presses. We have good information on cost. Here's a journal entry for the cost of press number 1. On average, presses cost about 54 florins each. And the cost of a printing press doesn't change no matter how much is produced, so it's a fixed cost. But printing presses last a long time. How do we allocate the right cost to 1564? Presses were valued at 50 florins each when Plantin's estate was settled in 1590. That means that after 25 years of service, a press that cost 54 florins was still valued at 50. Now, some of that's inflation, but a lot of it is just that printing presses last a really long time. We could almost ignore the cost of presses with that kind of data, but we should err on the side of higher fixed costs, because if we still see a variable cost business at that point, then we are confident it's really variable. So I've assumed presses last 20 years and have assigned 1/20th of the cost of presses to a single year. 15 months worth is 11.8 florins. Next is typographical materials, which come in 3 types. As you know, on the right is a punch, which is used to make a matrix in the center. The matrix at the bottom of a mold receives liquid metal, which becomes the cast type on the left. Plantin leased his punches and matrices to the partnership on an exclusive basis for 60 florins a year. So this one also is pretty easy. 15 months at that rate is 75 florins. That brings us to cast type, which is not easy. We have 2 issues. First, is cast type a fixed cost? Second, what is its value in 1564? First, cast type wore out quickly. It had to be replaced. Paulus Manutius once said that his type wore out in 4 months. In 1564, Plantin bought replacement characters for fonts that he had bought earlier in the year. This wear is directly linked to production. If more books are printed, more type must be replaced. So this is the characteristic of a variable cost. Second is calculating the cost. We can't just attribute the expenditures in 1564 to operations in 1564 because the business was growing very rapidly. A lot of the cast type that year was actually for the future. Plantin was buying type to bring more presses online, which he did very rapidly. So to deal with this, I turned to a cost accounting method that the textbooks call the account analysis method, which is really just a fancy term for looking at how a cost behaves over time and making a reasonable estimate of what you think it ought to be. This chart contains all the data I have. The blue bars are the average number of presses working in a given time period, red on the right-hand axis. The yellow line is cast type expense, red on the left. The red line is that expense divided by the number of presses to give us expenses per press in operation. You can see that Plantin bought lots of cast type in 1563, 4, and 5. By 1566, the buy had fallen dramatically. It went back up after 1570 because Plantin was operating a lot more presses. But the red line, expenses per press, is actually fairly stable between 1566 and the average there of 70 to 76. Let's look at the red line in detail and change the scale. We see that in 1566, his expense per press was almost identical to the 6-year average, 1570 to 76. Both of these were times of stable operations. He wasn't growing so much in either of those time periods. And I think that this is the variable cost of replacing cast type. Before 1566 was accumulation for future growth. After 1576 was a severe downsizing where he was probably cannibalizing his existing stocks. So that gives us an expense of 85 florins a year for each press in operation. For our time period, that's 372 florins. And this is our first variable cost, which I put in blue on the chart. Now, the 2 most important variable costs are paper and production labor. Look at the magnitudes. 940 florins on labor, 1,560 on paper. The scale of the chart had to change to accommodate them. These are the two costs that Plantin tracked for every edition in his cost accounting system. So our figures are in place. Let's do the analysis. Back to the cost structure chart. Our airline model had 30% fixed costs. The restaurant had 10. Plantin Partnership in 1564 had 7% fixed costs, even more variable cost driven than our restaurant model. I did a similar calculation for 1566, relying on Leon Voot's tabulation of some of the costs, and the results are consistent with that. Plantin was operating a variable cost business. So what does that mean for his decision making? The most fundamental, actually, stay with this for a second. The most fundamental conclusion is this. Plantin had a strong incentive to produce books he thought would sell quickly, enough to cover his paper and labor costs. But unlike an airline, he had virtually no incentive to produce just to employ his fixed assets. Think of the risks of his business. If he had to downsize, his fixed assets weren't that valuable. And he could sell stocks of unprinted paper, he could let labor go, all of that at low risk. But once he converted paper into printed sheets, he could only get his money back if the market demanded that specific book. He had to be confident he could sell enough copies. His big risk was to print too much, not to print too little. And in some respects, that's the opposite of the behavior of a capital-intensive business. So what sort of incentives did this create for him specifically? Let's look at three. First, to reduce production in bad times. He had real incentive to move quickly when times turned bad. Unlike the airline, he didn't have to worry about maintaining volume. And this chart shows that he followed that incentive quite closely. The blue line is the number of presses in operation, and the black line is the number of employees paid, both as of January of each year on the chart. This is actually Raymond DeRuver's chart. Let's look, there's a lot of examples on here. Let's just look at two. First is 1567. The Spanish army occupied the Low Countries, and Plantin's partners fled. He shut down 2 presses and cut employment 40%. 1576. Plantin shut down completely after the sack of Antwerp in the Spanish Fury. He just about went bankrupt, and you could say that saving his business after the Fury was one of the great achievements of his career. But he could only do it because he could reduce production quickly and cut off cash outflows. If he'd had heavy fixed costs, the financial burden would have been too great. Second incentive, treat each book as a separate risk. His incentive was to focus less on the risks of the enterprise and more on individual books. Too many presses wouldn't sink him, but a run of bad books would. He had to sell enough copies fairly quickly to get his variable costs back. The analogy I think of is actually a Broadway theater producer or a Hollywood movie producer. In both cases, the costs are almost entirely variable. Each musical, each movie is a separate investment. The production companies frequently enter joint ventures for just one movie, or they raise capital for a single show on Broadway. And the records show that Plantin did manage his risk significantly on a book-by-book basis. In 1564, nearly 1/4 of all the books he published involved some sort of risk sharing with another party. Sometimes he pre-sold a lot to a bookseller before he began production. Other times he created a joint venture with another publisher who shared costs. Frequently, that other publisher would sell his copies with his own title page. The Lucan of 1564 is a good example of a pre-sale. Plantin sold 300 copies of this, nearly 1/4 of the run, at 30% off retail in one bulk sale. Plantin split the press run of the 1565 Albertus Magnus with the Antwerp printer Antonius Tillens. Tillens supplied the paper for the entire press run and got half of the copies back in return. Third, an incentive to plan quick recapture of variable costs. Let's see how this works for a specific book. Plantin's 1564 edition of Erasmus's Adages. He printed 1,250 copies and spent 157 florins on labor and paper. Now, a useful way of looking at it is a break-even chart. Plantin didn't draw these, but they summarize his incentives. The blue line is the 157 florins that he spent on labor and paper. That money is spent no matter how many copies he sold, and so it's constant across the chart. He sold the book for 5.5 staufers per copy, so his revenue increased with every copy sold along the green line from the first copy to all 1,250. The lines cross at 570. That's break even. If he could sell 570, he would cover his labor and paper costs. If he sold more, he'd be in the black and he'd be bringing cash in the door without any further cost. If he sold less, he'd be in the red. He would have spent cost on labor and paper that he did not earn back through the sales. So his incentive here was to think about placing blocks of copies that would get him within reach of break even and have that plan in place before he went into production. By the way, break-even charts also show the value of risk sharing. Remember the 1564 Lucan? Here's a break-even chart for that. Plantin's labor and paper costs were 61 florins, that's the blue line, and the price was 2 staufers, that's the green line of revenue. His break-even is 611 copies. But remember, he did an advance sale of 300 copies for 20 florins. Here's how that affects the chart. First of all, that's a 33% cost reduction. He knew he had cash in the door of 20 florins to knock that down. And then it moves his break even. With that expenditure, he now has a break even of only 404 rather than the 611 that we had before. And I should note that one beauty of these data is that we could prepare a chart like this for almost every book that was produced in that time period. So where does this take us in the future? Knowing that Plantin's business was driven by variable costs, we can focus on those, just like he did. When I complete data entry, we'll have a database with variable costs by format, language, genre, number of copies, degree of illustration, maybe principal font size, maybe paper quality, still thinking about those. And we'll also have data on risk-sharing arrangements, markups, and the presence of competing editions in the marketplace. Christoph Selezak reminds me that Plantin never made a decision to print Hesiod. He made a decision to print 1,250 copies of Hesiod in octavo, on cheap paper, without a Latin translation, in the face of 2 competing editions in the marketplace, with no risk-sharing arrangement, and setting the price to give him a low break-even point. With this kind of data, I hope we can see into the mind of Plantin as he grappled with these decisions. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much indeed, Mark. As I was looking at those figures, I was translating them mentally into the sums which I do about every fortnight about the production of Cambridge University Press. The questions are much the same.